In August 1945, Japan's cities were ash: Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Tokyo, firebombed into rubble. The country had lost 3 million people, its industrial capacity, 93% of its steel production, obliterated. The average Japanese person was eating 2/3 of what they ate before the war. Hyperinflation destroyed the currency. People were literally starving. 35 years later, in 1980, Japan's GDP hit $1.065 trillion. It was the world's third largest economy, behind only the United States and the Soviet Union. Japanese cars flooded American streets. Sony Walkmans were in every teenager's pocket. The nation that America had bombed into submission now threatened to overtake America economically. How does a country go from total defeat, occupation by foreign soldiers, no resources, no money, starving population, to economic superpower in just 35 years? The answer involves American dollars, a war in Korea, and a mathematical plan so ambitious that even the Japanese government thought it was impossible. But what they built wasn't just an economy. It was a system that would eventually consume itself. Here's the question: was Japan's economic miracle actually a miracle, or was it something else entirely? To understand how Japan rose from the ashes, you need to see what 1945 actually looked like. You're standing in Tokyo, September 1945. American soldiers occupy your country. Around you, there are no buildings, just foundations. No factories running. The bridges are gone. The ports are destroyed. Your neighbors are burning furniture to stay warm because there's no coal. The coal mines that used to run? Staffed by Korean and Chinese forced laborers who refused to work the moment the war ended. Production collapsed overnight. The Japanese government printed money to pay demobilized soldiers, to pay for military contracts that were never delivered, to pay compensation for war losses. Prices exploded. Between April 1946 and March 1949, wholesale prices increased 13 times. A loaf of bread that cost you 1 yen in 1946 cost 13 yen in 1949. Japan's GNP in 1946 was less than half what it had been before the war. Industrial production in 1948, 40% of its 1937 level. The challenge facing Japan wasn't just rebuilding. It was rebuilding from less than zero while occupied by the country that had bombed you into oblivion. Enter the Americans with their own agenda. Initially, American occupation policy was punitive. Keep Japan weak, break up the big industrial conglomerates, the zaibatsu, implement land reform, empower labor unions. The idea was simple: make sure Japan could never threaten the Pacific again. But then 1947 happened. The Cold War began. The Soviet Union and Communist China became America's enemies. Suddenly, American strategists looked at the map differently. Japan wasn't the enemy anymore. Japan was the bulwark against communism in Asia. A weak Japan meant a vulnerable Asia. A strong Japan meant a fortress. The policy reversed. They called it the reverse course. Here's how it worked. First, forget everything you think you know about post-war reconstruction. This wasn't the Marshall Plan. This was something different. Imagine you're Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru in 1950. Your country is still occupied. Your people are still hungry. Your factories are idle. Then, on June 25, 1950, North Korean troops cross the 38th parallel and invade South Korea. Within days, American soldiers stationed in Japan ship out to fight, and they need supplies, immediately. Where do they get them? Japan, right next door, already occupied, already under American control. This is the Korean War procurement boom. Here are the numbers. In 1950, American procurement orders to Japan totaled $149 million. By 1951, it hit $590 million. By 1952 and 1953, over $800 million each year. To put that in perspective, Japan's entire export trade in 1949 was less than $1 billion. Suddenly, American procurement represented 60 to 70% of Japan's export income. The Americans were buying everything: ships, pharmaceuticals, oil, beer, trucks, airplane repairs, military vehicles. Companies like Toyota, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, Mitsui, all on the verge of bankruptcy, suddenly had contracts worth millions. But here's where the magic happens. The Japanese government didn't just take the money and distribute it. They directed it. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI, created a system called Inclined Production Mode. Priority went to raw materials, coal and steel, everything else came second. How? Tax breaks for corporations, targeted investment in heavy industry, export incentives, relaxed anti-monopoly laws that allowed the re-emergence of keiretsu, massive business groups linking banks, manufacturers and trading companies. These groups were so large, so financially powerful, they could outspend any competitor, foreign or domestic. The government approved over 1,500 cartels and collusive activities. Mergers among the 5 largest firms in any industry were waved through. The whole point was to eliminate competition, domestically and internationally, and it worked. By 1964, Japan joined the OECD, the Club of Developed Nations. By 1965, Japan's GDP was $91 billion. 15 years later, in 1980, it was $1.065 trillion. Japan became the world's largest producer of ships, steel, motorcycles and automobiles. Sony, Panasonic, Honda, Nissan, Canon. These weren't just companies, they were global brands. The rural population collapsed. In 1945, about 50% of Japanese lived in the countryside. By 1970, less than 20%. Millions of farmers moved to cities, working in factories, building the cars and electronics that flooded global markets. And the Japanese people, their standard of living soared. In the 1950s, families saved money in postal savings accounts. The government lent those savings to corporations for capital investment. Workers got lifetime employment guarantees. The middle class exploded. By the 1980s, Japan was rich. Not just rich, envied. Americans feared Japanese economic dominance the way they once feared Japanese military power. This was the miracle. But there's a catch. The same system that built Japan's economy also created its greatest vulnerability. Remember overloaning? Banks lending far beyond what companies could repay, backed by the Bank of Japan. That system required one thing: endless growth. As long as the economy kept expanding, companies could service their debts. As long as companies kept borrowing, banks stayed profitable. As long as banks kept lending, the government maintained control. But what happens when growth slows? By the 1970s, the first cracks appeared. The 1973 oil crisis hit Japan hard. The country had no natural resources. Everything was imported. When oil prices tripled, Japan's industrial engine choked. For the first time since the war, industrial production declined. The government responded with more of the same, more lending, more stimulus, more intervention. It worked, for a while. Growth resumed, but the rate slowed. The 1950s and 1960s saw 10% annual growth. The 1970s averaged 4.6%. The 1980s averaged 4.1%. Still impressive, but the trend was clear. Slower. Every decade slower. And the system itself? It was a Ponzi scheme. Think about it. Banks lent money they didn't have to companies that couldn't repay. Those companies invested in production capacity for markets that might not materialize. As long as exports grew, as long as new markets opened, the machine kept running. But Japan's trading partners started pushing back. The United States and Europe demanded Japan open its markets, appreciate the yen, reduce export subsidies. In 1985, Japan agreed to let the yen appreciate. Within 2 years, the yen doubled in value against the dollar. This made Japanese exports more expensive. Suddenly, the engine that had driven growth for 30 years started sputtering. The government's response? Lower interest rates. Flood the economy with cheap money. Encourage borrowing. This created the 1980s asset bubble. Land prices in Tokyo skyrocketed. In 1972, land prices were 25 times higher than in 1955. By the late 1980s, the property under the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was theoretically worth more than all of California. The stock market soared. Banks lent against inflated real estate values. Companies borrowed to buy more assets. Everyone got rich, on paper. The inevitable consequence was coming, but that's not all. While Japan's economic miracle created unprecedented wealth, it also created unprecedented sacrifice. Japanese workers were dying at their desks. Karoshi, death from overwork, became so common the government had to create a word for it. Salarymen worked 60, 70, even 80-hour weeks. Lifetime employment meant lifetime obligation. You didn't leave your company owned you. Families paid the price. Fathers worked. Mothers raised children alone. Housing conditions in cities were miserable. Apartments with 125 square feet of living space, smaller than a parking space, were normal. Shared bathrooms, shared kitchens, 3-hour commutes. The dream of owning a home became impossible for millions. By the 1970s, housing prices had outpaced wages so dramatically that the average Tokyo worker would need their entire salary for 20 years just to buy a modest home, without spending a single yen on food, clothing, or anything else. And the human cost? The rural countryside emptied. Villages that had existed for centuries disappeared. Elderly parents were left behind while children moved to factories. Traditional culture, the farms, the festivals, the community bonds, eroded. Japan traded its soul for economic growth, and for a generation, it seemed worth it. Then the bubble burst. In 1991, the stock market crashed. Land prices collapsed. Banks that had lent trillions against inflated assets found themselves holding worthless collateral. The miracle ended. Japan spent the next 3 decades trying to escape what they called the lost decades. Near zero growth, deflation, aging population. The system that built modern Japan couldn't save it. So here's the answer to our original question. Was Japan's economic miracle actually a miracle? No, it was a strategy. A strategy that worked brilliantly for 35 years and then failed catastrophically. Japan went from defeated nation to economic superpower, not through magic, but through ruthless focus, government control, American support, and human sacrifice. The question for you: would you trade your quality of life, your freedom, your time with family for economic growth? Would you live in a 125 square foot apartment, work 80-hour weeks, and never see your children if it meant your country became rich? Japan made that choice. For a generation, they believed it was worth it. If this video made you think differently about Japan's post-war story, hit subscribe. We cover the untold stories of World War II and its aftermath. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.